The Andares relay station sat quiet at the edge of charted space, a wheel of metal turning slowly against a field of stars. It was a small outpost, built by the Tren Alliance to watch the trade lanes that connected a dozen worlds. 42 people lived and worked there. 6 of them were human. Dr. Elena Voss was one of them. She ran the station's medical bay, treating everything from Tren lung fevers to the strange bone injuries that came from working in low gravity too long. She liked the quiet hum of the station, the smell of recycled air, the soft chatter of alien voices in the halls speaking languages she was only half fluent in. It felt like home, in its own strange way. That piece ended on a Tuesday, station time. 3 ships dropped out of warp without warning. They were old, patched-together vessels, the kind used by scavengers and raiders who lived outside any government's control. The galaxy called them many things: pirates, drifters, free hunters, but everyone who had dealt with them called them by a simpler word: murderers. The group behind these 3 ships was known across a dozen systems as the Kel Reavers, and they did not board stations to talk. Weapons fire tore through the station's outer hull before anyone could send a distress call. The Tren security forces, lightly armed and never trained for real combat, were cut down in the first few minutes. Reavers stormed through the corridors in heavy suits, rounding up survivors with practiced ease. This was not their first raid. It would not be their last, unless someone stopped them. Elena was dragged from the medical bay along with 2 nurses and a Tren engineer named Asu, who trembled so hard his breathing tubes rattled. They were pushed into the station's cargo bay along with 20 others, hands bound with plastic restraints, forced to kneel on the cold floor. The leader of the Reavers was a broad-shouldered being called Draith Kor, a name known and feared in 3 systems. He walked the line of prisoners slowly, studying faces, sizes, species. He was not looking for people to kill. Not yet. He was looking for value. Humans, he said, stopping in front of Elena and the others. His translator device hissed slightly with each word. Rare. Valuable. The council pays well to have you returned unharmed. Elena said nothing. She had heard of the council's policy before, a long-standing agreement across many species that ransom, though distasteful, was sometimes the price of peace. Raiders took hostages. Governments paid. Hostages went home. It was ugly, but it worked, in its own broken way, for almost every species in the galaxy. Draith Kor smiled beneath his helmet. He had done this many times with many species. The Tren paid. The Myral paid. Even the proud Skarn Empire, for all their warlike pride, quietly paid when their people were taken. It was simply how things were done. Nobody wanted a war over a handful of hostages. He assumed humans would be no different. He was wrong, though he did not know it yet. Word of the attack reached the nearest Tren command outpost within hours, and from there it moved fast, jumping from relay to relay until it reached the Galactic Council chamber itself, a vast circular hall on the neutral world of Ashel Prime, where representatives of nearly 40 species sat to discuss matters that crossed their many borders. Ambassador Sella Vanter of the Tren stood before the chamber, her voice tight, with controlled anger. 42 hostages, she said, including 6 humans. The Reavers demand payment within 72 hours, or they begin executions. A murmur passed through the chamber. This was routine, in a terrible way. Council members had seen this before. Ransom negotiations were painful, but manageable. Every species had a price they were willing to pay to bring their people home. The human representative on the council, a calm woman named Ambassador Rowan Cole, sat quietly through the announcement. She had been briefed only minutes before entering the chamber. Her aide had handed her a data slate with 3 words on it, sent directly from Earth's Unified Defense Command. We are handling it. When the council turned to her, expecting the usual question, how much would humanity contribute to the ransom pool? She surprised them. Humanity will not be paying any ransom, she said simply. The chamber went still. Counselor Ver, an elder of the insectoid Choran species, tilted his head in the universal gesture of confusion shared by his kind. Ambassador Cole, 6 of your people are held captive. Their lives are at risk. Surely you understand the arithmetic of this situation. I understand it perfectly, Rowan said. That is why we will not be paying. She did not explain further. She did not need to, not yet. Because while the council debated and argued and tried to make sense of her answer, Humanity was already moving. Far from Ashel Prime. In the black spaces between systems, a small fleet of human ships had shifted course the moment the distress signal reached Earth's monitoring network. They were not warships in the traditional sense, sleek, fast vessels called response cutters, built specifically for situations exactly like this one. Humanity had learned, generations ago, watching other species suffer the endless cycle of raids and ransoms, that paying criminals only bought a short peace and a long future of more raids. Humans had decided, quietly and firmly, that they would handle their own problems differently. Captain Marcus Webb commanded the lead cutter, the ISV Steady Hand. He had been given the mission briefing only an hour after the attack, delivered directly from Fleet Command with none of the usual bureaucratic delay. The orders were short and clear. Locate the hostages, neutralize the threat, bring their people home. No negotiation. No payment. No exceptions. Webb read the file on Draith Core and the Kel Reavers twice. 40 confirmed raids across the past 6 years. Hundreds of lives lost, either in the raids themselves or in the years the Reavers spent free afterward to raid again, funded by ransom money paid by frightened governments too afraid to fight back. Every credit sent to the Reavers had bought more weapons, more ships, more raids. It made Webb's jaw tighten. This was exactly why humanity's policy existed. Ransom did not save lives. It only postponed the next tragedy and made it larger. Back on Ashel Prime, the council continued to argue, unaware that anything had already begun. Some counselors demanded Rowan explain her refusal in full. Others quietly worried what would happen to the human hostages if no payment came. A few, the older and wiser members of alien species who had studied Earth's history from a distance, exchanged glances that suggested they suspected something the rest of the room did not yet understand. Rowan Cole simply sat, hands folded, and waited. 72 hours. That was the deadline the Reavers had given. She knew, though she said nothing, that humanity would not need nearly that long. On the station, Elena Voss knelt in the cargo bay beside the trembling engineer Asu, listening to Draith Core laugh with his crew about the fortune they expected soon. She looked toward the small viewport at the edge of the bay, toward the dark stars beyond, and allowed herself, quietly, a small flicker of hope. She did not know exactly what her people would do, but she knew, without question, that they would not be paying. She had grown up hearing the old stories, the ones every human child learned early. Humanity did not bargain with those who took innocent lives for profit. It never had. It never would. Somewhere out there, in the dark between the stars, help was already coming, and it was not bringing money. It was bringing something else entirely. The ISV Steady Hand cut through the dark at speeds that would have torn apart a lesser ship. Captain Marcus Webb stood on the narrow bridge, watching the navigation display count down the distance to the Andari's relay station. Behind him, 2 other cutters flew in tight formation, the Quiet Storm and the Iron Vow, each carrying a small team of specialists trained for exactly this kind of mission. Webb had served 11 years in the Unified Defense Command. He had flown rescue missions before, though never one quite this public. Word of Ambassador Cole's refusal to pay ransom had already spread through council channels, and alien news networks were beginning to ask questions. Webb ignored the noise. His job was simple. Get to the station. Get the hostages out. Stop the Reavers from ever doing this again. Time to arrival? Webb asked. His navigator, a sharp young officer named Priya Anand, checked her console. 40 minutes, Captain. We'll drop out of warp on the far side of the station, out of sensor range, just like the plan. Good, Webb said. Signal the away teams. Final briefing in 10 minutes. While the cutters raced through space, back on the council floor at Ashel Prime, the debate had not settled. Ambassador Rowan Cole sat through hour after hour of questions, objections, and quiet worry from other species representatives. Counselor Beolt of the Chorin leaned forward again, his mandibles clicking with unease. Ambassador Cole, he said, I ask you again plainly. If no payment is made, what do you expect will happen to your people? They will come home, Rowan said calmly. Alive. You cannot know that. I do know that, she said, because I know my people are already working on it. A murmur spread through the chamber again. Some counselors exchanged doubtful looks. Others, particularly the older representatives who had studied Earth's history and its strange, stubborn refusal to negotiate with raiders, watched Rowan with quiet interest. They had seen this pattern before, in smaller incidents over the years. A human freighter attacked here, a colony threatened there. Each time, humanity had responded the same way. No payment, no negotiation, only action. Ambassador Selevanter, still shaken from the loss of her station's security forces, spoke next. Even if your people succeed, Ambassador, you risk provoking further violence. The Reavers may kill hostages in retaliation the moment they sense a rescue attempt. Rowan's expression did not change. That is a risk we accept. It is smaller than the risk of feeding this problem money for another 10 years. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. Nobody had an answer for that. Back near the Andari's relay station, Drathkor paced the cargo bay, checking the time on his wrist display. 30 hours remained before his deadline. He was not worried. He had done this many times, and every civilized government eventually paid. It was simply a matter of patience. He walked past the line of kneeling hostages again, stopping in front of Elena Voss. Your council debates, he said, his translator crackling. They always debate. In the end, they always pay. Elena looked up at him, steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. Not this time. Drath laughed, a low rasping sound. You believe that. I know it, Elena said. He studied her for a long moment, then turned away, unimpressed. He had heard defiant words from prisoners before. They rarely meant anything. What he did not know, what none of the Reavers knew, was that the station's old emergency beacon, damaged in the attack but not fully destroyed, had managed to send more than a simple distress call. Buried in the signal was a burst of technical data, station layout, security camera feeds, even partial life sign readings from the cargo bay. Unified Defense Command had received it all within the first hour of the attack, long before the Council even finished discussing the ransom demand. Captain Webb had studied that data during the entire flight. He knew exactly where the hostages were being held. He knew the number of Reavers on the station, their weapons, their patrol patterns. By the time the Steady Hand and its two companion ships dropped out of warp behind the station's blind side, Webb's team already had a full plan mapped out, rehearsed twice during the flight in the cutter's cramped briefing room. Listen up, Webb said to his strike team, gathered in the narrow launch bay. 12 soldiers stood before him, checking their gear one final time. We go in quiet. No warning shots, no wasted noise. Teams Alpha and Bravo breach through the maintenance shaft here. He tapped the display, straight into the lower deck, away from their sensors. Team Charlie takes the docking clamps. Make sure none of their 3 ships can undock once we're inside. And the hostages, sir? Asked a young soldier near the back. Cargo bay, deck 3, Webb said. Once Alpha and Bravo clear the corridor, we move straight there. Get our people and the others moving to the extraction point. No negotiations. No hesitation. And Drathkor, someone asked. Webb's face hardened slightly. If he surrenders, he stands trial like anyone else. If he doesn't, he paused. Then he doesn't leave that station. The soldiers nodded, grim and ready. This was not their first mission, but it carried more weight than most. The whole galaxy was watching, whether the Reavers knew it or not. The 3 cutters powered down all but essential systems, drifting silently around the curve of the station's hull, invisible to the Reavers' outdated sensors. Small breach pods detached quietly, drifting toward the maintenance shaft Webb had identified from the station's old blueprints. Inside each pod, soldiers checked their weapons one last time, breathing slow and steady, waiting for the signal. Back in the cargo bay, Elena Voss felt a strange shift in the air, though she could not explain why. Maybe it was the almost unnoticeable hum of the station's old life support system changing rhythm, or maybe it was something else entirely, a feeling, buried deep, that something was about to happen. Asu, beside her, noticed her stillness. What is it? He whispered, his breathing tubes rattling with fear. I don't know, Elena whispered back. But I think it's starting. At that exact moment, in the narrow maintenance shaft 2 decks below, Captain Webb's glove touched the release mechanism on the breach pod door. He looked once at the small chronometer on his wrist, confirming the timing matched perfectly with teams Bravo and Charlie. He keyed his comm, voice low and controlled. All teams. On my mark. A pause. Silence, heavy and waiting. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The maintenance shaft door blew open with a controlled, near-silent charge, and Webb's team moved into the station's lower corridor like shadows, weapons raised, boots landing soft against the metal floor. Somewhere above them, in the cargo bay, Drathkor checked his wrist display again, still smiling at the thought of the ransom soon to come. He had no idea that humanity had already arrived. He had no idea that the 72 hours he had given the Council would never be needed. And he had absolutely no idea that in the next few minutes, everything about this raid, and every raid the Kel Reavers had ever pulled, was about to end. The maintenance corridor smelled of scorched metal and cold recycled air. Captain Webb moved first, weapon raised, eyes scanning every shadow. Behind him, Teams Alpha and Bravo spread out silently, boots barely making a sound against the worn deck plating. The station's old blueprints had been accurate. No Reaver patrols walked this stretch of corridor. It was too narrow, too forgotten, exactly the kind of place a careless raiding crew would overlook. Priya Anand moved at Webb's shoulder, her scanner glowing faintly in the dark. Deck 3 access is 40 meters ahead, she whispered. 2 guards posted at the junction. Standard rifles, no heavy weapons visible. Webb nodded once. Bravo, take point on the guards. Quiet takedown only. We don't want gunfire this early. 2 soldiers slipped forward, moving low and fast. The Reaver guards, bored after hours of standing watch over frightened prisoners, never heard them coming. Within seconds, both raiders were down, disarmed and bound before they could raise an alarm. Webb allowed himself a small breath of relief. So far, everything was going exactly to plan. Meanwhile, above them near the docking clamps, Team Charlie worked fast and quiet. 6 soldiers moved through the narrow access tunnels toward the docking bay where the 3 Reaver ships sat connected to the station. Their job was simple but critical. Make sure none of those ships could undock and escape, no matter what happened inside. Sergeant Dale Kimura, leading Charlie team, reached the control panel first. He studied it briefly, then nodded to his engineer, a quiet young man named Tobias Reyes who specialized in exactly this kind of technical work. Lock the clamps, Kimura said. Make it permanent. Reyes worked fast, fingers moving across the panel, rerouting power and overriding the release mechanisms one by one. Within minutes, all 3 docking clamps were locked tight, their control systems fried beyond any quick repair. The Reaver's ships were no longer an escape option. They were now, quite simply, traps. Back in the lower corridor, Webb's team reached the junction leading toward the cargo bay. Through the narrow gap of a half-open blast door, Webb could see the edge of the room where the hostages knelt, and beyond them, several armed Reavers standing casually, weapons slung lazily over their shoulders. They had no idea what was coming. Webb held up a fist, signaling his team to halt. He studied the room carefully, counting heads. 6 visible guards. Drathkor, standing near the center, still talking loudly to one of his lieutenants about the ransom money soon to arrive. 20 or so hostages kneeling in tight rows, hands bound, heads down. This was the dangerous part. A firefight here risked hostage lives. Webb needed to be precise. He turned to his team, voice barely above a whisper. Alpha, you're with me. We take the guards nearest the hostages first, quiet if we can. Bravo, hold this junction, make sure nothing gets past you from the upper decks. The soldiers nodded, faces set with quiet determination. Inside the cargo bay, Elena Voss knelt beside Asu, her knees aching against the cold floor, her wrists raw from the plastic restraints. She had noticed something strange in the past few minutes. A subtle change in the way 2 of the guards near the back wall kept glancing nervously toward the corridor behind them, as though they'd heard something they couldn't quite explain. She said nothing, keeping her eyes low, her heart pounding. Drathkor, still confident, continued pacing near the center of the room. 72 hours, he said loudly, mostly for the benefit of his own crew rather than the hostages. The Council always pays before the deadline. They will pay early, in fact, to avoid the embarrassment of losing hostages publicly. One of his lieutenants, a thin raider named Vosk, frowned slightly. Commander, the humans. They refused already. Word came through the relay before we jammed the signals. Drath waved a dismissive hand. Words mean nothing. Money speaks louder than pride. They will pay. He did not know that at that very moment, 12 heavily armed soldiers were less than 30 meters away, moving through the shadows toward him. Webb's team reached the edge of the blast door. Through the narrow gap, he signaled silently, 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The breach was fast and precise. Alpha Team moved through the door in a tight formation, weapons raised, taking down the 2 nearest guards before either could fire a single shot. The sudden violence sent a ripple of shock through the room. Hostages flinched, some crying out in surprise, while the remaining Reavers scrambled for their weapons. Down! Everyone down! Webb shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Gunfire erupted across the cargo bay, sharp and deafening in the enclosed space. Webb's soldiers moved with practiced precision, taking cover behind cargo crates, picking off Reavers one by one as they tried to organize a defense. It was over in less than a minute. Of the 6 guards in the room, 4 were down, wounded or worse, and the remaining 2 dropped their weapons, hands raised in surrender. Draith Kor, caught in the open when the attack began, dove behind a stack of supply crates, drawing his own weapon, his earlier confidence replaced by cold fury. Impossible, he snarled, mostly to himself. They came. They actually came. Webb spotted him immediately, recognizing the Reaver leader from his intelligence briefing. Draith Kor, he called out, voice steady despite the tension. Surrender now. This ends peacefully, or it doesn't end well for you. Draith's response was a burst of wild gunfire from behind the crates, forcing Webb and 2 of his soldiers to duck for cover. You think this changes anything? Draith shouted. There are always more raiders. Always more targets. You cannot stop what we are. Webb exchanged a quick glance with Priya Anand, crouched beside him. She nodded, understanding without words. While Webb kept Draith's attention with careful return fire, 2 soldiers moved along the side of the room, using the chaos and scattered crates for cover, slowly circling toward the Reaver leader's position. Elena Voss, still on the ground near the center of the room, pulled Asu close, shielding him as best she could from the gunfire. Stay down, she whispered. Almost over. Asu's breathing tubes rattled with fear, but he nodded, trusting her without question. Draith Kor fired another wild burst, forcing Webb's team to keep their heads low, but it bought him only a few more seconds. The 2 soldiers circling his position reached the edge of the crates, weapons raised. Drop it, one of them shouted. Draith spun, realizing too late he was surrounded. For a brief moment, he considered fighting to the end, his pride refusing to accept defeat. But the cold reality of 12 armed soldiers, 3 locked Reaver ships, and a station he no longer controlled settled over him like a heavy weight. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his weapon and raised his hands. Smart choice, Webb said, stepping into the open, weapon still trained on the Reaver leader. Team, secure him. Zip ties, full restraints. We are not taking chances with this one. As soldiers moved in to bind Draith Kor's wrists, Webb turned his attention to the hostages, still huddled on the floor, many of them shaking with shock and disbelief at the sudden, violent end to their captivity. This is Captain Marcus Webb, Unified Defense Command, he announced, his voice calm and clear despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. You're safe now. We're getting you all out of here. Elena Voss looked up, tears welling in her eyes, relief flooding through her exhausted body. She had believed, deep down, that her people would come. But seeing it happen, seeing the soldiers moving calmly through the wreckage of the cargo bay, cutting restraints and helping the injured, was something else entirely. Asu, beside her, let out a long, shuddering breath. You said, they wouldn't pay, he whispered. They didn't, Elena said softly, wiping her eyes. They came instead. Across the cargo bay, Draith Kor knelt in restraints, his earlier arrogance replaced by a cold, dawning understanding. He had raided dozens of ships, taken hundreds of hostages, and always, someone had paid to bring their people home. He had never once considered what would happen if someone simply refused. Now he knew. And soon, so would the rest of the galaxy. The medical bay of the ISV Steady Hand was crowded but calm. Elena Voss sat on the edge of a cot, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching as the ship's doctor moved between the rescued hostages, checking wounds, offering water, speaking in soft, reassuring tones. Asu sat nearby, his breathing tubes finally steady, his wide eyes fixed on the small viewport showing the stars outside. We are truly safe? He asked quietly, still not fully believing it. "We are," Elena said. "It's over." Not far away, in a reinforced holding cell built into the lower deck of the steady hand, Draith Kor sat in silence, his wrists bound, his once confident posture now slumped and defeated. Two guards stood outside the cell, weapons ready, watching him closely. He had said nothing since his capture, his mind still struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Captain Webb stood outside the cell for a long moment, studying the Reaver leader through the reinforced glass. Draith finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You should have paid," Draith said, his voice low and rough. "Everyone pays. It is how this galaxy works." "Not anymore," Webb replied simply. "Not with us." Draith's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. Webb turned and walked away, leaving the Reaver leader alone with his thoughts and the slow, sinking realization that his entire way of life had just come crashing down around him. News of the rescue reached Ashel Prime within hours, carried across the relay network at speeds that left even seasoned diplomats stunned. Ambassador Rowan Cole received the full report in the middle of another tense council session, her aide quietly placing a data slate in front of her. She read it once, then again, allowing herself a small, quiet breath of relief before standing to address the chamber. "I have an update," she said, her voice calm and clear. "The hostages held at Andari's relay station have been rescued. All 42, including the 6 human captives, are safe and receiving medical care. The Reaver leader, Draith Kor, has been captured and is being held for trial. No ransom was paid." The chamber fell into stunned silence. Counselor Beolt of the Chorin stared at her, his mandibles clicking rapidly in a display of shock. "No ransom," he repeated slowly. "You sent soldiers instead." "We did," Rowan confirmed. "In less than 2 days," Beolt continued, still processing. "You located the station, planned an assault, executed it, and captured the raiders responsible, all without a single credit changing hands." "That is correct," Rowan said. A murmur spread through the chamber, disbelief mixing with something that sounded almost like admiration. Ambassador Selavanter of the Tren rose slowly from her seat, her expression a mixture of relief and something more complicated. "Ambassador Cole, on behalf of the Tren Alliance, I thank you for the rescue of our people alongside your own. But I must ask, plainly, why humanity refuses ransom so completely. Other species pay because it is safer, because it avoids further violence. Why does Earth see it differently?" Rowan considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because we learned, a long time ago, that paying ransom does not end violence. It funds it. Every credit paid to raiders becomes new weapons, new ships, new raids against someone else's people next month, next year. We decided, generations ago, that we would rather spend our resources building the ability to respond directly than feeding the cycle that creates the danger in the first place." "And if the rescue had failed?" Beolt asked quietly. "If your soldiers had arrived too late?" "Then we would have mourned our people," Rowan said, her voice steady but heavy with old, understood grief. "As we have mourned before. But we would not have paid. Because paying does not save the next station, or the next ship, or the next group of innocent people taken by someone like Draith Kor. It only guarantees there will be a next time." The chamber was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. Many of the older counselors, species who had dealt with raiders and pirates for centuries, understood the weight of what she was saying. They had seen the endless cycle themselves. Pay, rebuild, raid again, pay again. It was a wound that never healed, only reopened again and again. Counselor Yeshel of the Myril, a quiet and thoughtful representative who rarely spoke during council sessions, finally rose from her seat. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is time other species reconsidered their own policies." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with implication. No formal decision was made that day, but something had shifted in the chamber, a crack forming in decades of accepted practice. Back aboard the Steady Hand, preparations were underway to transport the rescued hostages to a nearby medical station for further treatment, while Draith Kor and his surviving crew members were prepared for transfer to a secure facility to await trial. Captain Webb walked through the ship's corridors, checking on his soldiers, most of whom were exhausted but unharmed, their mission a clean success by any measure. He found Elena Voss in the medical bay, sitting quietly with a cup of warm tea in her hands, watching Asu finally drift into an exhausted, peaceful sleep on a nearby cot. Dr. Voss, Webb said, approaching quietly. How are you holding up? Better now, Elena said, offering a tired smile. Thank you for coming. Just doing the job, Webb said simply. It's more than that, Elena said, shaking her head slightly. Drathkor told us the council always pays. He seemed so certain of it. I think he genuinely could not imagine another outcome. Webb nodded slowly. That's the problem, isn't it? When something works often enough, people stop imagining it could ever fail. The Reavers built their entire operation on the assumption that fear and patience would always get them what they wanted. And now? Elena asked. Now they know it doesn't work on us, Webb said. And maybe, after today, a few other species will start asking themselves why it should keep working on them either. Elena looked down at her tea, thinking of the trembling fear she had felt kneeling on that cold cargo bay floor, believing help might never come in time. She thought of the strange, quiet confidence she had held on to anyway, the old story she had grown up with about humanity's stubborn refusal to bargain with those who caused harm for profit. I always believed we wouldn't pay, she said quietly. I just wasn't sure, until it happened, what that really meant for people like Drathkor. It means their business model just got a lot more dangerous, Webb said. Every raider in this sector is going to hear about Andari Station. About what happens when they take human hostages expecting an easy payday. Elena managed a small, tired laugh. Do you think it will change anything? Really? Webb considered the question honestly. Maybe not everything. There will still be raiders. Still be desperate people willing to take hostages. But maybe, slowly, other species start to see there's another way to handle it. Maybe fewer stations get hit in the first place, because raiders start thinking twice before targeting anyone who might respond the way we did. Far below them, in his holding cell, Drathkor sat alone with his thoughts, the weight of his failures settling deeper with each passing hour. He had built his reputation, his fortune, his entire operation on a simple, reliable truth understood across 100 worlds. Hostages meant leverage, and leverage meant payment. He had never once accounted for a species that simply refused to play by those rules. Now, as his ship sat locked and disabled at Andari Station, as his crew awaited trial, and as word of his defeat spread rapidly across the trade lanes and into the ears of every raider crew in the sector, Drathkor finally understood, far too late, exactly what kind of mistake he had made. He had bargained with murder as his currency. And the one species that refused, absolutely and completely, to accept that currency had just ended his career, his freedom, and very likely the reputation of every raider crew who might try the same thing against a human target ever again. The galaxy was learning a new lesson, one station, one raid, one failed ransom at a time. Humans did not bargain with murderers. And now, everyone would remember it. The trial of Drathkor took place 3 weeks later, in a neutral courtroom on Ashel Prime, under the joint jurisdiction of the Galactic Council and the Unified Defense Command. It was, by galactic standards, a swift and simple proceeding. The evidence was overwhelming. Station security footage, testimony from dozens of surviving hostages, and Drath's own recorded words admitting to years of raids across multiple systems. Elena Voss sat in the small gallery reserved for witnesses, watching as Drathkor stood before the panel of judges, still restrained, his once proud posture now hollow and defeated. Asu sat beside her, fully recovered, though his breathing tubes still rattled slightly whenever he grew nervous, which was often during proceedings like this. The lead judge, an elder Tren jurist named Corvith, read through the charges slowly, methodically. 40 confirmed raids. Hundreds of lives lost or endangered. Decades of ransom payments extorted from frightened governments across a dozen systems. When the reading finished, Corvith turned to Drath directly. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Drath was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, still processing the collapse of everything he had built. Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and tired. I did what raiders have always done. Take hostages. Demand payment. It worked for years, across 100 worlds. I did not expect, he paused, searching for the right words. I did not expect anyone to simply say no. And now? Corvith asked. Now I understand, Drath said quietly, that some prices are not worth paying. And some species will not pay them, no matter the cost. The sentencing came swiftly after that. Life imprisonment on a maximum security facility orbiting a distant, uninhabited moon, alongside several of his surviving crew members. It was not the harshest sentence the council could have handed down, but it was permanent, and it was final. Drathkor would never raid another station, take another hostage, or threaten another life again. As the guards led him from the courtroom, he paused briefly near the gallery, his eyes finding Elena Voss among the small crowd of witnesses. For a moment, something passed between them. Not quite an apology, but perhaps the closest thing to acknowledgement a man like Drathkor was capable of giving. "Your people," he said quietly, almost to himself, "changed something today." Then he was gone, led away to a cell he would likely never leave. The ripple effects of the Andari's rescue spread far beyond that single courtroom. Within weeks, reports began surfacing from across the sector of other governments quietly reconsidering their own policies regarding ransom and hostage negotiations. The Tren Alliance, still shaken from the loss of their security forces at the station, announced the formation of a new rapid response fleet modeled loosely on humanity's unified defense command approach. The Myral, long known for their strict adherence to ransom diplomacy, opened formal talks with human military advisors, seeking guidance on building similar rescue capabilities of their own. Not every species agreed with the shift. Some argued, reasonably enough, that not every government had the resources or military strength to respond the way humanity had. Ransom, for smaller or weaker civilizations, remained the only practical option when raiders struck. Ambassador Rowan Cole acknowledged this openly during a later council session, careful never to suggest that humanity's path was the only right one.